Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of September 28th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the very same Texas Politics Project. Good early fall, late summer afternoon, Josh?
Let's just call it fall. Come on. I want it to be fall. Summer's over.
That's what I like. That's what I like about you, your optimism.
Wow. Yeah, is that it?
Well, speaking of which, I thought our theme today might be kind of based on the big picture of the policy output of the 87 Texas legislature so far, still in action and still putting out a lot of stuff, including new maps that I suspect we'll jump to next week when we've got all three maps and had a little more time to look at what's out there and seeing how much they're going to change. The Senate map has already changed, right? From the one they rolled out that I think we might have talked briefly about. But today we do want to talk about, I think, the policy output of the 87th legislature. And one of the big questions that is hovering out there right now about the handful of high-profile kind of boundary testing conservative legislation that the legislature has passed. And that's, how far is too far? At what point does attempting to cater to conservative support within the primary universe of the Texas Republican Party go too far and beyond the point that it's politically a good idea, shall we say? And that's, bracketing the policy consequences. But this has been a big part of the discussion since the legislature really, following June and the legislature's first pretty substantial cut at these policies, but also, since the legislature has been strung out, into this third session and running, this has really gotten a lot of airing out. So I thought we'd look at this in the realm of some particular issues. And the most obvious issue is abortion, but also things obviously like gun policy, elections, border security. And maybe end by talking a little bit about how we answer this question and the strengths and limitations of that. Our default is to look at public opinion.
Right.
And particularly right now with an eye on the unfolding election calendar. And we'll try to come back to some of this. Now, we should flag that our friend and frequent collaborator Ross Ramsey focused on the public opinion piece of this in a column in the Texas Tribune earlier this week. And Ross looked at selected examples of where public opinion was and pointed out that many of these measures, even though they're being criticized as anti-majoritarian in a larger sense, perhaps, they still enjoy substantial, if somewhat varying degrees of Republican support. Now, that's a very tangled kind of construction, and there's a lot going on there. But I think where this really comes out is let's start by focus on something simple.
Yeah,
we'll focus on probably the most complex, but also kind of the most currently high visibility subject, abortion. And Josh, you just assembled a ton of data for a piece that's on our blog, so you should go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu and click the blog, and Josh's piece will be at the top of this. So what did you find through this lens when you looked at this huge amount of abortion data that we've collected over the last decade?
Yeah, I think the first thing, I guess, that's sort of the overview piece to kind of set the table for abortion attitudes in Texas is probably just to point out that they're probably, they're definitely not nearly as extreme as the output of the legislature would suggest. And this is what I think a lot of people, when they're asking this question about how far is too far, part of the idea here is that, that the legislature in general is putting out legislation across a range of policy issues that don't doesn't really look, people would often say democratic. I get a lot of questions about how democracy is functioning in Texas in terms of the translation of attitudes to policy. And, it's hard not to look and say, well, it's at best you'd say, okay, sort of. Some places, yes.
Yeah.
Some places,
Democracy is a complex little critter.
It is. It is. So just a couple, quick things on abortion attitudes in Texas. Now, again, I think the backdrop for this, obviously, I'm going to say, I don't know if this is the foreground or the background. It kind of depends on how you look at it. I mean, the backdrop for this, obviously, is that the state has passed, some of the most restrictive abortion legislation in the country. For all intents and purposes, access to abortion is limited to about 2 weeks, functionally in the state, setting aside some of the other provisions of that legislation. And so, Texas, after chipping away at sort of abortion access for the last decade, really made some big, big steps forward. And so the question is, how is this likely to be received amongst the public? And so,
forward for that agenda, I think we should probably say.
Right. And so, a couple of things just to point out here about Texas public opinion. Number one, we ask in our usual UT polls whether or not voters identify as pro-life or pro-choice. Ultimately, for the most part, voters in Texas are about split on this. About equal shares identify as pro-life and pro-choice, and that's important, I think. So when you look at the legislation, if you want to look at the legislation, say, boy, Texas must be the most pro-life state in the country. It's maybe based on the legislation, but not necessarily based on the way that voters identify themselves. You go and take a look at another item where we ask about, when people should be able to access abortion. And one of the, findings in Texas, which is also true generally, is that a really, really tiny minority of people would actually ban abortion in all circumstances, as the state would do if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. Now, of course, this is a little bit of semantics, and some people would basically say the state has basically already banned abortion for the most part, especially if there's no access. But in Texas, as of recently as February of this year, only 13% of Texans said that abortion should never be permitted. That's 13%. That included only 21% of Republicans, among who the plurality would permit, abortion in these sort of common circumstances that we think about: rape, incest, danger to the life of the mother. And this is super consistent. This is consistent finding across the length of the poll. We've asked this question 10 times, and this is usually what it looks like. We've also looked at this, data nationally. This is what it looks like. I think the most interesting thing probably is the next thing that I looked at, which was, we've asked about a lot of different abortion policy in Texas over time. And without getting into the details of all of this, because there's a lot, and I think you should go look at the blog. It's a little...
It's pretty amazing when you look at that, there's a table in Josh's blog post, how many questions we've asked going back, a very long time, even before I think you were part of the poll, or right around the time you were starting, maybe. But, a lot of questions, there's a lot of, it really underlines the degree to which, as you said, the strategy for the last decade and a half, really, longer than that, actually, the strategy from a political point of view of anti-abortion advocates has been to chip away.
Yeah,
and to make incremental gains that, seem to not to be in some, you tell me if this is right. I mean, the way I've always described this is, as I'm looking at the numbers, I think it's right, exist in a kind of gray area between enjoying something like majority of support, but also not activating enough opposition to really become a problem, if you will.
Well, that's right. And I think, that's actually almost, perfectly describe a lot of the questions that we never asked. Because what I say in the blog post is like, look, here's a bunch of questions we asked about, transvaginal ultrasounds and, the burial or cremation of fetal remains, 20-week bans, judicial bypasses. For instance, we've asked about a lot of stuff. The thing is, there's a bunch of stuff that we even couldn't ask about that's actually almost more central, but it's almost because it's actually, I know exactly why. It was because in a lot of ways, those laws were designed to not really be easily interpretable. So for example, what we never asked about was a requirement that, abortion providers meet the standards of ambulatory surgical care facilities, right? Which is basically to be able to have all of the infrastructure built into already existing facilities to basically make them hospitals. Now, the purpose of that law was it was eventually knocked down, but it was effective, which was to reduce the number of abortion clinics in the state from, I think, about 50 at the time to about 19 after the law got passed, even though it then got struck down by the courts. Another similar one was requiring doctors to have abortion doctors to have admitting privileges to hospital. These are, what I would say is these are, policies that on their face are very much quote unquote common sense to a lot of people, because abortion facilities should have doctors with admitting privileges, whether that's necessary or not. I'm just talking to your normal average voter. Why shouldn't an abortion facility meet these set of standards? Whether or not I have a lot of strong opinions about what the standards of abortion facilities and medical facilities should be, but the effect of them was ultimately to basically reduce the number of abortion facilities in the state. And so we couldn't really ask about those questions in any sort of way that didn't really, mix together the messaging and the politics, and in a way that actually, reflects the fact that a lot of these policies, this is true of all policy, not just abortion policy, are designed to either, garner, majority support in the way that they're described, or at the very least, a blunt opposition.
Right.
The interesting thing is when you look at these policies over time that we have measured, is that net support really kind of across the board has declined pretty significantly. And my kind of, pet simple theory, and I've mentioned this before, is just the policies have become more extreme. They've walked more and more to the line of reducing or restricting access. And also after a decade of this, I think people are just getting wiser to the fact that these laws are, all going towards the same goal, which is to eliminate abortion in the state.
So let's just then ask the question. It sounds to me like you're, in the same way that the laws are walking right up to the edge, you're walking right up to the edge of saying this could be too far.
Well, I mean, this is, sure. I would say so. I mean, and I always start the piece, I say this because, based on my age, which I won't say here exactly, but where I am in politics and how I've watched this evolve over time, I've always heard this discussion be, Republicans don't really want to ban abortion because if they do so, there's going to be a revolt on their hands. So, women who've been used to having a certain amount of reproductive freedom for the last 50 years are going to say, nope. But, I think if 2020 and really most of the Trump years have taught us anything, it's to ask ourselves whether anything matters. And I know that that's a little nihilistic and, a little too simple a way to put this. We can kind of talk about the whys of this. But I would say that this is, these policies are really walking up to the edge of what voters have at least expressed that they are willing to accept, which is they're willing to accept, a 48-hour waiting period. They're willing to accept hurdles that women have to jump over in order to receive an abortion. What's less clear is whether they would accept a revocation of access to abortion in all circumstances. And that's something that the data certainly does not support. And, Republicans in this legislative session have really walked right up to in a way that does beg the question, is there going to be backlash? Does it matter?
Now break that down a little. Because the key question here is, where do subgroups line up? If we step back for a second, we're looking at this, what is essentially a de facto abortion ban, in all but very, very, very few cases. Mm-hmm. Where are partisans on this? In other words, because it seems to me that we do see that Republicans lose support for this, but not at a critical level in terms of a Republican primary.
Well, I think that's, you brought this up earlier, and I think, that is kind of the thing that sits in there. You said, this is kind of complicated, but now we're here, so we're going to get into it a little bit, right? Which is you can look at the law at the top line level. So we say just overall in the electorate, what does this look like? And you see a bunch of policy, especially in this most recent legislative session, where, it's pretty close to evenly split. It's not all of it, but, for the most part, you're looking, when you see a majority, we're talking about pretty small majorities, and then there's big partisan differences. One of the things that define those partisan differences, I would say, is that, the extremity of Democratic opposition, the unanimity of it, the near unanimity of it, is something that's just sort of becoming increasingly apparent as we measure public opinion. I think, I used to describe Texas at least as, it's a conservative state, and the Democrats are relatively conservative, at least compared to their national counterparts. And I've worked in the background on a piece on ideology and sort of, liberal identification. But ultimately, the Trump years did something to Democrats here, in a way that, at this point, their reaction to most state policies and also to state politicians looks as if you're talking about national politics and national politicians. The idea that, there's a conservative element to the Democratic Party here seems less and less to be the case. So on the one side, you have near unanimous and intense opposition among Democrats. On the Republican side, I think, what you see, and you can see this, in the data is, essentially, again, the same kind of patterns we're talking about. You still have majority or plurality support for almost every one of the policies we've discussed. But the issue is that, the intensity of that support is less apparent. And also, there now are, I would say, significant minority shares of Republican voters who are opposed to some of these kind of banner policies. And when I say I'm talking about, somewhere between, let's say, somewhere between 15 and 30%, depending on the policy. And it could be a little bit higher, who basically oppose the policies that Republicans are essentially running on right now going into the primary session. And that raises that question of, well, does that matter? Again. Now, I mean, not to jump ahead, but I mean, my answer is kind of no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do want to jump ahead on that, but I also want to compare this a little bit. I mean, in terms of the overall frame here,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you compare this issue to guns?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I think this is I'd say it actually maps really well.
They're broadly similar, interestingly enough.
Right, they are, which is that, if you were to describe either one of these policy areas similarly, you'd say, what's the most extreme version of the policy in this domain as far as, Republican goals are concerned. We, basically walked up to that extreme in a lot of cases a few years ago. For example, in 2019, we were talking about a 6-week abortion ban. It didn't go anywhere. We were talking about permitless carry. We didn't go anywhere because the votes weren't there, and the perception was that the public wouldn't accept it. Ultimately, the public hasn't gotten any more accepting of these policies, but we've gone there. And so now you have something, again, I think, the example of permitless carry, where you do have a policy that is definitely going to be popular in Republican primary elections. I don't think any Republicans are worried about having to defend their vote on permitless carry in a Republican primary. But it doesn't mean that you don't have, an intense majority of Democrats opposed, a majority of independents opposed in most cases, which is something that, Republicans are going to have to increasingly contend with in a competitive state. And now you've got about somewhere around a third of your party on the guns. It's a little bit more apparent. We're like, well, maybe this still was a little too far. I mean, 2 years didn't change where we were on this.
So I think that, just as a very quick aside, or not even, it's almost like put a pin in it. This really does remind me, as I've looked at this, I've been going through the data from the last poll, and we've talked about it, and we're in such a contentious environment between Republicans and Democrats, and there's this whole piece of the focus on the primary. I think it's going to be time to revisit, the old piece on the growing role of independents again. Yeah. Because independents are very interesting in the way that they move around in these issues, but also in the way that in some ways, they don't move. Right. Right. And so I think that's interesting. So, I think what's useful here a little bit then is to contrast the kind of divisions and the tensions that you're seeing with these banner issues of abortion and guns with immigration, where you don't see that tension among Republicans nearly as much. There are other kinds of tensions that have to do with ethnic groups, in particular Hispanics, but also I think in an understated way a little bit, also African Americans. Those obviously, especially Hispanics in Texas. But the differences in immigration, I think, really, are really stark, in that you don't see these kinds of divisions even as you get pretty extreme on immigration. And I think, in the latest poll that's been evident in, or in the last couple of polls, that's been most evident on support for Texas paying for a wall and for spending on border security, where, there's not a lot of dissent among Republicans.
Yeah, there's almost no dissent among Republicans. I mean, we say this kind of jokingly from time to time, but, this idea that, immigration and border security is the issue that unites all factions of the Republican Party. And, we've kind of, for a while, I think, at least I was sort of, struck by the extent to which immigration and border security are seen as a state issue here in the state. The longer I've lived here, and I would also say to the extent that, we've seen increasing numbers of frequent sort of migrant surges at the borders, it's beginning to make a lot more sense that it is a state issue in a lot of ways. I mean, it really is in a way I think it isn't in other states, but nonetheless, I mean, you can look at immigration attitudes of, Republicans in Iowa and Minnesota. They're not going to look significantly different than the attitudes of Republicans here in Texas, which is why it's such a valuable issue and why everything often gets turned back to it. It's like, well, we're talking about COVID, or no, we're talking about immigrants with COVID. Right. We're talking about, giving people unlicensed access to firearms. It's like, well, it's to protect yourself. And do you know how dangerous it is down at the border, by the way? I mean, you can always kind of turn these issues back to immigration here in the state, and whether it's, artful or not, whether it's sensitive or not, you're definitely playing to an audience that's receptive to this because they're thinking about it. It's not a jump for most Republican
Well,
voters.
it's so incredibly salient to Republicans, but it is also, as you're, I think, kind of implying here, I mean, it's also very immediate in terms of something experiential, even if you're not living on the border. I mean, it's still something that is covered in state news, state media coverage, state political discussion. And of course, the science among Republicans gives the party that is the party of government, in Texas. There's no two ways about it. A powerful talking point and a powerful subject to go back to. When there are crises and when there are problems, but also when there aren't.
Yeah, I mean, the question that gets, sort of raised about this in the context of the discussion we're having here about how far is too far. And I think, again, a lot of observers wonder this is, how often can you talk about, how often can you be in Texas talking about immigrants and immigration, in which, what you're generally referring to as Hispanic immigrants and immigration, especially from Mexico and others, Central and South American countries. How often can you turn policy towards that and take, such a prohibitionist or restrictive or putative tone and not turn off the growing share of voters in the state who are Hispanic? And this is one of those things where, if you dive into the data, it's like, well, there really hasn't been a lot of evidence that that's a connection that, I would say at least Hispanic voters who identify with the Republican Party and Republican priorities are making. It doesn't mean to say that there aren't more potential Hispanic voters out there in the electorate that Democrats could try to mobilize on these issues. But it's not as though when Greg Abbott talks about, for example, giving the Department of Public Safety the authority to pull over vehicles suspected of carrying undocumented immigrants with COVID, which is, more or less a license to racially profile drivers, that, Hispanics in the state writ large are looking at that and say, that's an example of discrimination. There's really, at least as of right now, limited evidence that that's the case.
Well, I mean, I think I'd have to go back and look at this again. But I think this really does go back to, something I probably raised in the podcast before, but it is that, that there are moments when, and I think this became something that was very common in the 2000s and early 2010s, and really during, I thought Rick Perry is kind of the innovator here in some ways, of finding subtle ways, at least in the right moment, to separate out border security and immigration. Mm-hmm. Because as I remember, the kind of show me your papers laws did pull somewhat lopsidedly. I mean, not as lopsidedly as one might expect, but somewhat lopsidedly with Hispanics in a way that the border security stuff does not.
Yeah, but it's all within the same range.
I mean, it's a fairly narrow range.
And I think we should just say what it is, which is just to be clear here. So we're not saying that, Hispanic voters in Texas as a whole aren't, let's say, quote unquote, liberal on immigration policies as a group, as just a description. The issue here is that there's somewhere between 30 and 40% of Hispanics, pretty much regardless of the issue. You could maybe go into the high 20s, but somewhere in there, who, for all intents and purposes, take the prohibitionist view on almost every immigration question we could ask. And also, generally, those are the same, those are the same distribution of, job approval for the governor and, right. A bunch of other things. And so, that distribution is a lot more fixed. And I would say, goes across a lot more issues than I think people really, tend
to assume.
Well, to assume. I mean, not to jump ahead. I'm not even jumping ahead at this point. I don't think, if it's okay to kind of talk about the broader piece here. And I think this is sort of the difficulty as just anyone trying to sort of figure out, how far is too far. Because on the one hand, you can kind of look at these things individually and say, well, this abortion law is too far for these groups maybe, or, this gun law is going to turn off, people will start coming up with suburban women, right? What have you. And there's a couple difficulties with this. And one is, do we think about this in terms of, the individual, sort of the individual reactions to individual pieces or, suites of legislation as being somehow determinative of people's vote choice. And here we're not even talking just about, reaffirming what people are going to do. We're actually talking about the small subset of people who might switch their preference from what they would normally do, because that's what we're really interested in a very, that's where it would matter in a competitive state. Right. Or is it just sort of like, that basically this sort of choice, this choice to switch, regular preferences, let's say from Republicans to Democrats, if one assumes that Republicans have gone too far, and that's really the argument here, is somehow a function of the sum of the policy output that the legislature has done and some kind of summative determination of all these things and say, this is too extreme. And the problem is, there are just too many constraints on voters for a lot of this stuff to really sort of in and of itself matter. I'm not saying that it doesn't all matter. It's not going to create change. But what bothers me is when I hear people saying like the legislature did X, so Y is definitely going to happen now. Right.
Right. I mean, the kind of underlying his assumption is that, a big share of voters are going to make a summative, as you put it, a summative judgment of the legislature and switch their preferences.
Right.
When it seems to me, there's a lot of, there's just so many things that we have to think about in terms of how public opinion gets translated into something that's political, meaningful, and actionable in the process, and impactful. Really, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, and it's also conditioned by the fact that there are a bunch of constraints. Just to name a few, people already have party identification. So ultimately, if I'm a Democrat, I'm probably going to vote Democrat. If I'm a Republican, I'm probably going to vote Republican. Even if I'm if I'm part of that, let's say 20 to 30% of Republicans say, boy, permitless carry. No abortion for rape or incest, and you kind of go,
that's a little nuts.
Yeah, that's not really what I've signed up for. But you know what the thing is that negative partisanship means I probably dislike Democrats more than I like Republicans if I'm the type of Republican who's turned off by those policies.
Right. That's the other piece we need to just crank out is that negative.
I've got it sitting here. I'm queuing it up.
Yeah, I've used it in a couple presentations and it, goes well.
But just to give the quick summary, piece of this, and I'll do it quick, which is that, essentially, if you look at Democratic Party, sort of basically attitudes towards Democratic Party and attitudes towards the Republican Party among Democrats, more Democrats have a more favorable opinion towards the Democratic Party than have an unfavorable opinion towards the Republican Party in terms of the intensity of that opinion. So we think it's sort of an affirmative, judgment. Strong Democrats are much more likely to sort of have a very favorable opinion of the party. Among Republicans, it's much more defined by negative attitudes towards the Democratic Party. And that goes across strength of partisanship. Right. So, even when we talk about this, that even if there are Republican voters who are turned off by the extremity that the legislature has taken either on an individual issue, some number of issues, or all these issues, it's going to take a lot, right? Yeah. For that person to go and say, well, now I'm going to vote for a Democrat. And I remember this I remember this the most during the 2016 campaign when people were like, yeah, but Republicans can't vote for Donald Trump. And I'd say, so they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton?
Right.
Right. And then I just add one other constraint here, which is just attention. We can't expect voters to focus on all these policies. And so there's the idea of a summative policy is kind of judgment is attractive, but it's difficult, and it's difficult to make people, to sort of get people there if they don't already have that view. And then, generally speaking, the question of, attention to what issue, it's not clear to me that these negative attitudes towards extreme policy are systematically distributed throughout the electorate. So we could say, if I look at policy A, B, C, and D that were like the banner, pieces of policy of the legislature, man, Republican, or let's say suburban women, which is, group of past, I mean, I'll come up again, I'm sure. Suburban women hate this stuff as a whole, right? Or I mean, what we've been talking about, or you go and look and say, man, Hispanics really don't like the policy. And ultimately, it's not really distributed like that because a lot of these policies hit people kind of in sort of different ways. And so it's not like it's not systematically distributed, I'd say, it's amongst groups who, if they were to switch their preferences from Republicans to Democrats, would flip the election. And that's also part of the difficulty. It's just the sheer volume of it makes it difficult to make a clear message about what people should focus on.
And you're just talking about so many different factors. I mean, if you're a person, asking the question, say a reporter,
sure. For example,
is this too far? There's just there are so many factors about how that gets translated. I think you're great at, that's a great description of the kind of just the baseline, individual, how you take the individual decision making and political cognition and the difficulty of aggregating that, at some level and how you think about that. And then just, the process and some of which are, all of which are operative and some of which are more operative than usual in Texas. If we're talking about some kind of, the trajectory that's suggested by, the conclusion that, okay, people have gone, the Texas Republicans have gone too far and they're going to pay for it at the general election. That's ultimately the argument.
Right.
Or at least the argument, if the answer to that question is yes, well, there's so many different process questions about that. From, your assumptions about who's participating in elections and what the capability is in terms of mobilization and counter mobilization between the two parties, even if you could, conclude that, yes, there will be a bunch of, Republicans out there that are ripe for the picking if you're a Democratic statewide
Yeah,
candidate,
sure.
right?
You can believe
which
that.
I think is highly questionable. But even if you accept that, well, what's the baseline we're talking about here in a state with, still has among the lowest rates of political participation? One of the stories of the last two election cycles is that, even without this question of whether you're going to get people to change their partisan preferences, Democrats haven't done a terrible job of mobilizing voters, but Republicans have done a much better job.
Yeah, I mean,
there is a, the narrative has traditionally been there's just all these Democratic voters out there. If the Democrats could just, get out there and mobilize them and get them to vote. Well, you know what? In a state with a turnout rate in midterm elections, below 50%, there's also a lot of Republican non-voters out there too.
Yeah. And and that's the thing that I think is what's sort of interesting to this and sort of that, does this matter? How does this affect things? And you're right. I mean, I'll raise this point, which is, it does bring up this issue of the reaction among less attached voters to everything. And the thing is, in particular here, what it does bring up is the fact that, Texas is still a competitive state. This is the thing. This is kind of what makes this interesting. People are kind of looking around and saying, boy, Texas has been pretty competitive. Why would Republicans go so far on so many of these policies? And part of my answer is because Texas is a competitive state, because they need to mobilize many voters to be competitive with Democrats. And honestly, you could say the idea that Republicans should, maybe dial it back a little bit, seeing how competitive it is. I'd say, yeah, once Democrats win something, maybe. Yeah. But until that happens, there's no argument for them to do that. And, so I think, it does make it sort of raise this issue again of, we do need to start looking at independent voters. We need to be start looking again at the more sort of marginal voters in the electorate, looking at young voters again is kind of an interesting piece in all this, right?
Although it is interesting that, I'm sitting here kind of nodding my head as you're saying that, and I'm thinking, it's consistent with that, but I guess the approach is softer among Republicans than one might think if we think about the thing that we beat like a dead horse on this podcast, but the 2018-2019 sequence. Right. In which, Republicans, at least the Republican leadership, do seem to take a more, they didn't call it moderate at the time. They called it practical or bread and butter or whatever. Kitchen. Yeah. Any number of, where, all of a sudden we're not talking about bathroom bills and transvaginal ultrasounds. We're talking about a little more money for, giving teachers raises.
Right.
And fixing the funding system and property taxes and, a different set of issues. So it's always interesting to me that there is a short-term subjective read among the political actors that affects these strategies and their attempts at agenda management. And speaking of agenda management, I think, that is also a piece that's really underlying this question of too far, not far enough, et cetera, is that I think does speak to your notion of constraints and the limited bandwidth that voters have, is that by the time we get to, a year from now, September and October, exactly. I would expect that there will have been, very pronounced efforts by Republican candidates to shape an agenda that, sort of shifts the relative weights of how much we're hearing about the things we're hearing about right now, if they can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And that again speaks to sort of the, again, the disadvantage the Democrats find themselves in holding, basically zero offices and no leverage to shape the public discussion for the most part. Right.
And, that, our Democratic friends sort of hate, the way that plays sometimes. And we're not saying they're, utterly without any influence, but, they're at a significant disadvantage.
Yeah.
In terms of shaping the public agenda, given that what they are likely to want to talk about in a year from now is going to be very different from what Republican candidates are likely to want to talk about.
Just to add to this conversation, it's just a different angle on something that you just brought up, which was, talking about the 2018-2019 cycle to show sort of the short-term reactions of the political, elected officials basically to electoral outcomes. And it's funny because, what I always tell people, it always shocks me when I talk about the electorate, and I'm realizing now it's true of electeds too, right? Is when I always talk about the electorate, I always think to myself, whenever an election season begins, it's always shocking to me how short people's memories are, just in the extent that, the campaign begins for president, for whatever. And it's as if the last campaign never happened, the last 4 years now, we're starting over. And and it's sort of just shocking, the idea that, whatever happened 2 years ago, 4 years ago does not constrain anybody, because voters don't really hold, I think, again, elected officials to any sort of sense of consistency over time, for the most part, within, pretty broad bounds. But I think that's also true of the elected officials. Ultimately, it's funny. It's like it's a goldfish in a bowl here. 2018 happens and oh crap. Well, we better do some serious stuff. And then, and then 2020 comes along and, Democrats like, we're coming. And then nothing happens. And Republicans like, well, okay, I guess permitless carry it is.
Yeah. I don't want to name any names, but I was, on a stage with a relatively pretty conservative Republican right after the 2018 election, talking very much about, how the constituent, he was hearing what his constituents were saying. They wanted, practical issues. That same person has been completely vocal in his support of
some of this,
the agenda of
right.
the 2020 session.
There we go.
To put it that way. So, and I want to end on one other point about this. I think really, your point about the short memory of everybody.
Right.
Right. We can fancy it up by calling it whatever, recency or,
there you go.
But the other piece is, there's a lot of, the play of structure and contingency also affects these things in very unpredictable way. And this has been, to understate the case, this has been a pretty big factor in Texas this cycle, with COVID, which has affected everything, of course. But also, and I still think this is very much lurking out there, the February power failures. These are big examples of the fact that there's also, we can parse this and we got this big pile of data and, we're looking at it in all this detail. There's a major shit happens factor that goes on here, in which all of a sudden, the context really shifts and actors have to adjust. Now, the fact that we hear very little about COVID from the state's leadership underlines the case that, people are not the elected officials are not powerful or are not without power to ignore problems or act as if they don't exist. Particularly when you have a monopoly on the, incumbency as we're seeing in Texas, as we're seeing with the pandemic.
You can even create the perception of problems where none exist. With that, for power.
Example, right? And so, I don't want to say we're just slaves to events, but events can scramble things in a way that, I think, remains to be seen how this is going to play out amidst this attempt to push the agenda in a certain direction. So I think on that, we are, a little over 30 minutes, a bit over 30 minutes. I want to thank Josh for being here. Thank our staff in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Urge people to visit Josh's blog and all this data we're talking about and more at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.